Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on migrating SOLIDWORKS data to 3DEXPERIENCE. My name is Marc Young with XLM Solutions. Let's begin. So for those of you who do not know us, we at XLM Solutions, we are what we consider a complete PLM solution provider. We specialize in 3DEXPERIENCE, both cloud and on-premise environments. We're also experts in SOLIDWORKS PDM and SOLIDWORKS Manage, some legacy systems like Innovia Smart Team, VPN, and then we also support other DS brands and PLM products. We've been around since 2005, so we bring many years of expertise, and we like to pride ourselves that we're highly respected in the PLM industry and throughout the Dassault ecosystem. In addition, we are a Dassault business partner along with a SOLIDWORKS certified professional service company, and that pretty much means we're not a VAR. We do not sell software, but we're recognized by Dassault and SOLIDWORKS to provide professional services and solutions on their products. We're always dedicating ourselves to quality and excellence. We're always staying up to speed on the latest trends, both from a business and technical point of view. Different digital transformation trends, system as record, system of information, ways to manage your data, and then obviously up to speed on the latest technical mechanisms, whether it be different languages or different ways for managing data. We've actually done a really big initiative now into AI, and you'll be seeing some information on us, how we are integrating AI and making use of AI within PLM systems, but we'll leave that to a different webinar. And then finally, we provide all aspects of, what I'd say is PDM, PLM implementations. We do everything from discovery workshops to general implementations, customizations, integrations to other systems like ERP, data migrations, which we'll be talking a lot about today, how to migrate SOLIDWORKS data into 3DEXPERIENCE, and then training and support. So let's get started. I use this slide all the time when dealing with migration topics, and we're using it here as well. But migrating or loading SOLIDWORKS data to 3DEXPERIENCE can be a daunting task. There's lots of details in doing such migrations. So I always say with diligent planning and testing, the process can go smoothly. And today we'll talk about strategies to ease that migration pain. Before any migration projects, especially when migrating SOLIDWORKS to the platform, I think there's some key questions to go over and answer at a high level. And, I list them out here. First of all, whoever is going to be using the data, consuming the data, is going to be a stakeholder in the project, really needs to have a good understanding of the UPS, Unified Product Structure Data Model. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a later slide, but you need to understand how that data model works and behaves. Basically, how is 3DEXPERIENCE going to be interacting with your SOLIDWORKS data? Don't just assume that there's going to be recommended data model mapping. So if you're going from SOLIDWORKS PDM to 3DEXPERIENCE, don't assume, oh yeah, this is how I'm managing my data in SOLIDWORKS PDM, and this is exactly how I should manage my data in 3DEXPERIENCE. They're different systems. They can be configured differently. PDM has a lot of flexibility in it. So, there needs to be some assessment how that data should be migrated over properly and how 3DEXPERIENCE should be configured to handle the data and the business processes at hand. And then, as mentioned, there's not necessarily best practices to manage data between data models, but there are tools to migrate CAD data. So that's where, consultants, business partners, system integrators come in to figure out how to best handle the processes, though there are tools to manage the CAD data. Migration scope, this is probably the basic question that's asked all the time, but do you want to migrate all data, just the latest data? Do you want to migrate all release data and latest in work? So what is that scope of data migration you want to work with? Will there be any data transformations? So we'll talk about that more a little bit later, but perhaps the simple example that I use also a lot of times is your revisions are numeric in the legacy system, but you want them to be alpha revisions in 3DEXPERIENCE. So do we need a mechanism to transform numeric revisions to alpha revisions? Or do we need to combine various title or description fields into one description field? Do we need to transform the data in any way from going from one system to the other? Will you be migrating to on-cloud or an on-premise environment? Probably majority of customers will be going to on-cloud, but for certain situations, whether it's ITAR, FedRAMP, government regulated, or other reasons, there may be a need to do an on-premise migration as well. And we'll talk about both cases in this presentation. And then finally, I always say, why are you migrating in the first place? It's just not about going to the latest and greatest software, but why are you doing that transition? I would hope that you're going to the latest and greatest software, i.e. 3DEXPERIENCE, because of new features and functionality in the tools that you can make use of in your business, and make your business as a whole much more productive by using those new tools. So you really need to understand how you're going to be using the system, how those new features and behaviors are going to work for you, and then a lot of that will dictate how that data should be migrated. But don't just say, I want to reinvent the wheel. How I use my data in my old system is exactly how I want to use it in my new system and make it look like that. It's not about just migrating apples to apples, but it's really about understanding your business processes, making it more efficient, and having this migration be part of a full digital transformation to better and more efficient processes and ways to use the data. So let's just talk about UPS, Unified Product Structure. This is going to be a very quick primer on the data model within 3DEXPERIENCE, specifically around SOLIDWORKS data. But the data structure stands for Unified Product Structure, UPS. You'll hear that term a lot. You may also hear the term powered by, which was sort of a code name for the Unified Product Structure, UPS. It's called the Unified Product Structure because there's one tree or one structure that represents both the CAD and the bill of materials. So in other PDM, PLM systems, in many cases there were multiple tree structures, mainly like a CAD tree structure, i.e. your SOLIDWORKS tree structure, but then a BOM or a bill of materials structure that represented the BOM because they may not necessarily be one and the same. In 3DEXPERIENCE, it's one structure. And that structure is made up of what's called physical products. The physical product represents the item, but in many cases, the CAD also represents the item. In many cases, that CAD structure is very similar to that end bill of material structure. So a physical product would represent an item, but it can also represent the CAD. And when we're talking about SOLIDWORKS, it represents the configuration within SOLIDWORKS. So, think of a screw with multiple configurations. Each configuration is a different length of the screw, hence each different length is a different part, and all those configs would represent different physical products within 3DEXPERIENCE. You also have 3D shapes. 3D shapes represent the actual file. So, if you had multiple configs, they would all be linked to the same 3D shape. And you can see that here in the structure. The blue items represent physical products. The white little icons represent 3D shapes within this structure. And then you can see, various metadata that are related to these items. Collaborative spaces are a way to group data to a structure that represents security. So every object in 3D Experience needs to be associated to a collaborative space, and based on what collaborative space it's associated to, it will govern the security rules around those objects. They're not necessarily, I'd say, folders, or definitely not folders. There's other types that represent those called bookmarks, but they're a way to again associate data to um, a grouping of data where security can be applied. Best practice is to minimize as many collaborative spaces as possible. And then again, if we need to talk about that in more detail, we can take that offline. And then there's many other types behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, but these are the key ones that we will be discussing mainly within this presentation. So as mentioned, CAD models, whether it's a SOLIDWORKS CAD model or coming from another CAD system, will be mapped to the physical product item and 3D shape. A lot of times I'll refer to it just as simply PP. Behind the scenes, if you look at the data model, it's called a VPLM reference object. For front-end users, it doesn't matter, but sometimes you'll see VPLM reference, whether it's in the documentation or or looking at the behind-the-scenes data model. But a VPLM reference and a physical product is the same thing. It's also sometimes referred to as an engineering item, but mainly you'll hear physical product. CAD drawings will be mapped to the respective drawing type in the UPS data model. So there's different types between a drawing and a model. You will obviously, through a migration, you'll need to map data, from your, whether it's your SOLIDWORKS properties, whether it's metadata from the legacy system, your data card properties in PDM, to the various UPS types. And I say, remember, config equals a physical product. So if you're mapping properties from the SOLIDWORKS model, it's really going to map properties from the config specific properties, not the file properties. So, when dealing with physical products and SOLIDWORKS data, really, you need to think about configurations to physical products, not necessarily the file as a whole. When we're dealing with variable mappings, obviously you need to understand what variables will be in place and what ones you will need to create as custom attributes to map to. There's a role within 3D Experience called Classification Manager, or CCM, and it's allows you to classify the data, and you can have specific attributes per those classifications. So a lot of times I like to create classifications of the data to put attributes on it, and versus putting them directly on the physical product. And you consider, going back to SOLIDWORKS PDM, I'll be using that a lot as an example, but you could have two different folders, an engineering folder and a manufacturing folder, and the data card for the SOLIDWORKS data could have different attributes on it. So one way to handle that in 3D Experience would be to create a engineering classification and a manufacturing classification, and then if you assign the part to one of those classifications, you can then get those specific attributes. You also want to consider if there's any special rules or automation governing who can fill out variables. Again, in PDM, you have logic to hide, who can see what based on data card, rules and permissions. These rules don't necessarily exist in 3D Experience. So if you have any special rules of how, data is filled out or who can fill it out, it needs to be discussed in more detail. Revision mappings, revision sequences. So you will need to have a revision sequence set up in 3D Experience. There's different revision patterns, whether it's alpha, numeric, mil-spec. or a custom revision pattern, but you will need to map to those revisions pattern based on the data you're loading. Meaning, any data you load, its revision will need to be the same as the revision pattern that you picked in 3DEXPERIENCE. Though there's situations that need to be looked at. If you're using both numeric and alpha revisions, i.e. a prototype versus production, then that revision mapping may be challenging when mapping a 3DEXPERIENCE. There's different ways that it can be handled, but that's not necessarily an out-of-the-box behavior. So if you do have multiple revisions, take that in consideration, and you'll need to come up with a plan. And we have some best practices that we have used to handle those different revision values. If you're using minor revisions, then again, that needs to be considered. There are no minor revisions within 3DEXPERIENCE. There's the concept of a primary and secondary revision, but it's not necessarily a minor revision. So if you need to handle minor revisions, you should do really a good testing and validation of how those will work, so that you can make sure that that functionality works as you need it to going forward. Assess how linked files represent derived output. So if you have all your SOLIDWORKS data to be migrated, but you also have what I consider derived outputs, i.e. a PDF of the drawing or a step file of the model, you need to see how those are handled. And the migration will not create those derived outputs automatically. It will create viewables of the SOLIDWORKS data, but not necessarily the derived outputs. So if you need the derived outputs, that's maybe something that needs to be created after the fact, or migrated after the fact, post-processing, to get those into the system. Definitely they can be migrated in, but not necessarily part of a core SOLIDWORKS data migration. And then finally, I always bring up this case. I don't know how applicable it is, but I believe it is a case that should be addressed. Remember, SOLIDWORKS is using the UPS data model, but there are cases where people have multiple CAD files that represent the same item. Maybe they have a red button, a green button, a blue button, and they're all modeled as separate CAD objects, but they all represent the same button part number at the end of the day. So how are you going to address, having multiple CAD that represents one item, or multiple items that represented by one CAD? Maybe you have a tabulated drawing or something like that. So, there's again methodologies and ways to handle it, but a lot of time is customer specific. So if you don't necessarily have a CAD or config to item correlation, you might have multi to one, then you have an issue. Now, if you just have CAD or you just have an item, those aren't issues. It's more the multi to one scenario that needs some additional thinking and discussion around it. So to sum a lot of that up, I talk about my pre-data loading analysis. I've used this slide before too, but really you need to determine where your data is coming from. Is it coming from a file folder base? Is it coming from a legacy system like SOLIDWORKS PDM that has a database and a vault behind it? Are you dealing with CAD files? Obviously this presentation is geared to SOLIDWORKS, so yes, but maybe you also have non-CAD files that's part of the migration. You have metadata, etc. For SOLIDWORKS files, usually dealing with the part assembly and drawings are easy. Configurations, if they do represent parts and have part numbers, they're easy. If you have configurations that represent more view states like open or closed, then the system can handle that, but there's probably a little bit more configuration and discussions around it. But also, how do you want to handle materials? Are you managing materials within your SOLIDWORKS files? Do you have routings or flexible parts, electrical data? Some of these more, let's say advanced SOLIDWORKS features, as they can be handled as part of the migration, need more consideration around them. So really understand the SOLIDWORKS data that you're dealing with. I probably also should have a bullet here regarding links. What type of links between that SOLIDWORKS data do you have? Is it just part assembly drawing links, or do you have, mirrored part links, in context links, or other, design type of links that may need to be managed? Um, where is that data coming from? Is it, coming from a legacy system? Do you have access to the system? Is all the data there? Are you missing files? Are you missing metadata? Obviously, dealing with SolidWorks, how are the links? Are your references between files good? Do you need to bring in additional experts to help analyze or get that external data out? You want to set up all your mapping rules. Before you start, you need to have a good understanding of how that data will be mapped. That'll be part of what I'd say is a mapping exercise, right after the kickoff of the project. But how are you going to map your metadata over? How are you going to map states? In PDM, you can have, your custom workflow of your custom states. In 3DEXPERIENCE, you basically have in work, frozen, released, and obsolete. So how do your PDM workflow states map to your 3DEXPERIENCE workflow states? We talked about revisions and revision conformity. What, types, this is pretty much covered for you, I would say, because as I said, models go to physical products, and drawings go to drawings. But if you had a extended data model, which is not very common, how would you do your type mapping? Collab spaces. So how do you associate the data to collab spaces? So they all get defaulted to one collab space, or there will be rules to put the data into other collab spaces. Bookmarks are kind of like the folder structure in PDM. And again, should the data get mapped to bookmarks or not? Do you need to map any classifications, as I mentioned, based on the data? Are there other links we need to consider, linking those derived outputs, or do you have specification documents that may need to be associated to the CAD or SolidWorks data, or any other special logic, such as transformation of the data need to be considered? So all these points need to be really discussed with the end customer and have a good plan of how they will be mapped to the system. And it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg, because sometimes you can't create this plan until the system is designed and configured for the end user. But at the same time, you necessarily cannot wait to start the data migration project until the system is fully designed. So this goes a little bit in parallel, and most likely will need to be repeated throughout the process as the system design gets more matured. But it definitely, an initial discussion should happen at the beginning. And then finally, data volume and load times. How much data are you dealing with? Do you think such data can be loaded over a weekend? Can we shut down, the working environment to load data over the weekend? Or, will we have to have a delta load to avoid, necessarily downtimes? So even though we do this at the beginning of the project, such things should be considered to figure out how that full migration will work. A data cleanup before any migration projects, we always talk about data cleanup, and the migration tools are very sensitive to the data. Bad data will either not be allowed to be migrated in the system, or bad data in is no good to users using the system. So a data cleanup exercise really should be done. And I list here a lot of, very common scenarios. So you could have duplicate part numbers that point to the same file, or you have the same part number that points to different files. So What's right, the file or the part number? Duplicate file names. Do you have the same, washer1.sld.prt used 10 different times in the system, each with a different part number? Are they truly different parts, or are they all the same part, but just got created multiple times? Missing or incorrect file attributes. The key attributes are part number, revision, description. Are those all valid? Are any of them missing? Um, Links. We'll talk about links and references throughout this presentation, but missing links or bad references is a big area where data will have issues being migrated to 3DEXPERIENCE. So making sure you have the correct references in place. Are you able to link your data to an organizational structure, i.e. collab space? So making sure you have the information in place to be able to handle the logic to link it to a collab space. As I mentioned, revisions not being compliant to the revision scheme you're using in 3DEXPERIENCE. And then this may not necessarily apply to SOLIDWORKS, it does apply to other CADs. Could you have like a large and a multi-level assembly structure that's referencing different revs of the same part? And if so, how should that be handled? Can you open up in SOLIDWORKS a assembly that's pointing to two different revs of the same part? So that's something that may need to be cleaned up. And there's tools out there. We have tools to help analyze the data. A lot of the times, you need to first analyze the data to understand what you're working with, and then from there, the cleanup necessary will be, very straightforward to do. So, in all projects, expect there will be bad data and expect that you'll need to do some data cleanup. I talk about missing references a lot and where that causes data to fail to import. Though the good thing is there is a setting within 3DEXPERIENCE to allow data to be saved with those missing references. Sometimes it's very hard to fix all missing references. So there's a setting there that will forgive that issue. Now, when migrating data, multiple revisions of the same file, will this setting apply? That is something. I know there's a lot of SOLIDWORKS experts on this call. Maybe they can chime in, but that needs to be vetted there. But this is a setting that will save a lot of time if you have missing references. Though again, as I say, bad data in equals, or bad data out equals bad data in. All right, so let's talk about some data sources, where data is coming from, and how they get into the platform. Again, the simplest is network drives. You have files on a network folder, and you want to load them to the platform. I kind of list here, some things, some considerations, and then how you can load that data. If you're managing multiple revisions on a network drive, well, first of all, congratulations on trying to do that, and good luck. But if you are managing multiple revisions, you need to figure out how best to associate those multiple revisions into a method to load the data into a 3DEXPERIENCE. If you're using single revisions, it's a lot easier, but multiple revisions, that link management becomes very difficult. In any case, if you have your properties in your SOLIDWORKS file, and again, you want them on the configuration tab, you can either do a manual save or a bulk save to the platform to load that data in, and it's very straightforward. For more complex cases, you can use other technologies like Transition Assistant and EDAT, but if you have data on network drives, usually the case is using the manual or bulk save options. Data coming from SOLIDWORKS PDM. Again, you probably need to do some data cleaning, which could be done at the file level, again, dealing with references, and maybe at the database level itself. Though Dassault has tools, again, EDAT and Transition Assistant, we'll talk about those in more detail to help automate or have a good way to migrate that data into 3DEXPERIENCE. Innovia Smart Team, very, very similar. Again, there's some data cleaning that may need to be done pre-migration, but you can also make use of the EDAT and transition assistant tools. If you have data coming from, let's say, a legacy 3D experience environment, Matrix 1 and Novia, or the Designer Central data model from 3D experience. Again, you might have to do some data cleaning. In Matrix 1, this is where, a lot of times those two trees come in play, the document tree and the item tree. They may need to be merged together into a unified tree. But again, there's Dassault tools, EDAT and XTA to help with those migrations. And then if your data is in another system, a more complex system like Teamcenter, Windchill, Eris, whatever, again, you may need to do some data cleaning. You may need to work on link management, making sure references all match up. But there's also technologies from Dassault that can be used, XPDM for on-premise and EIF for on-cloud to get that data into 3D experience. So that being said, there's simple tools to use. If you have network drives, there are Dassault pre-developed tools if you have Dassault products, and then there's other technologies available from Dassault to migrate the data over if you have a non-Dassault system. When doing a migration, I always say, and this is kind of a theme of the presentation, the systems behave differently. So you really need to understand the differences between your source system and your target system. Again, take SOLIDWORKS PDM. How you search in PDM is different how you search in 3D Experience. In PDM, you can do a data card search, where in 3D Experience, you're doing more of a Google search and then refining those search values based on 6W tags. Permissions. In PDM, you have very granular permissions, and in 3D Experience, the permissions are based on the collab space the data is in and the role you have, whether you're a leader or a reader or a owner. You have different permissions. License implications. So in PDM, again, there's almost three licenses, right? CAD contributor, viewer, and one more. In 3D Experience, licenses are based on the roles you buy, and there's many different roles. So depending on what you want to do, really depends on what role you have. Where in PDM, most things you can do is done with one simple license. Metadata, again, having attributes related to the data is straightforward between both systems. Though in PDM, like I said, you could have different data cards based on different folders. In 3D Experience, you'll do that, in a different way, i.e., perhaps through that classification of data. Workflow states and change or release processes are different between systems. So make sure you have a good understanding how that works. In any case, I always say we can always migrate the data over to 3D Experience. Though, how do you want to interact with the data within 3D Experience? And that is key. And this is, again, always a great opportunity to review your current business processes, understand what's working and what's not working, and make changes of how you want to work going forward as part of the migration effort. Though with any data migration, SOLIDWORKS to 3D Experience, or from any system really to any other system, it comes down to what I say is, two simple concepts. We're going to extract the data from the legacy system, and then we'll import that data into the destination system. So from the extraction point of view, anyone working on such a migration project should have familiarity with the legacy system. Most legacy systems can be reversed engineered. Again, take SOLIDWORKS PDM. If you look at the database directly, a lot of it makes a lot of sense how that data is organized. You want the ability to read, properties from CAD and look at links, between CAD files, SOLIDWORKS files, because probably there's some cleanup that you'll need to do, whether it's at the property or the file reference level. And want to extract the data out to a neutral file format. Just for fun, we listed a bunch of systems that we have done this for already. Again, you want to extract the data out to a neutral file format. In a lot of cases, XML is a good neutral file format. You could extract it directly into a format that can be run by the PLM system. And for 3DEXPERIENCE, whether you're on-premise or on cloud, the two formats that it likes is what's called XPDM. XPDM is a specific type of XML format, or StepX, which is, again, a specific type of XML format based on the STEP standard. When you're doing that extraction, this is a great time to transform the data if necessary. So again, if you need to transform alpha revisions to numeric or vice versa, update properties, merge properties, handle cases where there's no value to automatically put in a value, during that extraction process is a good time to do that data transformation. So how are some ways to get data into the system? We alluded to this in our previous slide, but the simplest I always say is manual save. So if you only have some small assemblies out there that you need to get into the 3DEXPERIENCE, it's simply just open them up in SOLIDWORKS and then do a save as via the SOLIDWORKS Power by connector. I'm using that term now to save them into the platform. Now, if you have shared parts between assemblies, then this manual save becomes more difficult, but that's probably the easiest way to do it. There's also a batch save mechanism that comes with the 3DEXPERIENCE connector, and that can allow you to pick full folders and save all the data in that folder to 3DEXPERIENCE. So here's a picture of the batch save tool that comes with it. You can pick what folder you want, what collab space you want to put that data in. You can even assign a bookmark where that data, what bookmark that data should be associated to. You have some analysis tools here as well, and then it will automatically save all that data to the platform. That's fairly easy to use and implement, and users can do it. It's done asynchronously, so it's not affecting what you're doing in the foreground, and you can map revisions and properties to 3DEXPERIENCE, assuming you have the revisions and properties correct within your SOLIDWORKS files. Revisions is a key thing, because sometimes your file's at revision C, and when you load it to the platform, you want it to go in as revision C, not revision A. So that has been supported, in the last years to be able to get the data in at its specific revision. Though this tool only works, really for data in a folder structure, a network structure, and best for only single revisions of data, not full history. And the data comes in work. If you want to release it, you would need to do another step to release that data. For larger scale migrations to on-premise, I have all my on-premise stuff first, even though probably on cloud is more applicable. But for on-premise migrations, there's a tool called EDAT that stands for Innovia Development Acceleration Toolkit. And this toolkit works for SOLIDWORKS PDM, Smart Team, File-Based, and the old Designer Central functionality. It has the following steps. It analyzes the data, it exports the data, and then it imports the data. This is based on this XPDM file format technology. It also makes use of ActiveMQ and SQL Express to log what's done and orchestrate the whole process. So you could be, in theory, exporting and importing in parallel. You could be, you could have already, let's say, exported parts and they're being imported, and now assemblies are being exported, in parallel of the parts being imported. Obviously, this handles full revision history, full property mappings. It pretty much can handle, all sorts of different data migration requirements. Though it does take, efforts to set it up, configure, and test it. So So having experience on the tool is key. It requires a license that you need to get from Dassault or your business partner. And it's mainly used for SOLIDWORKS and CATIA data, though it really supports other CAD too. So on cloud, so for on cloud migrations where you need similar functionality as EDAT, there's a tool called XTA or Transition Assistant. I think it's 3DEXPerience, but this is a tool that allows you to do full migrations from Smart Team, SolidWorks PDM, etc., into 3DEXPERIENCE Cloud. Again, it requires your data to be clean. It is data sensitive. I say fix broken references because for other CADs like CATIA, that's a true statement. For SolidWorks, we have that setting to give us some flexibility there. You have some configurable options of what data you want to migrate, how to map the data, etc. It does require a license. So it is a licensed product that you have to get through your business partner or through Dassault. That license includes test environments. So you never want to migrate the data, directly into your production environment, specifically for cloud environments. So you do get test environments to test out the migration, but you need to prepare those test environments and possibly copy over, configurations from the production environment to the test environment and keeping those environments in sync. As stated, this tool supports migrating data from Smart Team, SolidWorks PDM, from file-based systems, and also, I believe, with the latest release of the latest fixpack, it supports migrating from Designer Central, Innovia or 3DEXPERIENCE Designer Central to the new UPS data model. Again, it supports CAD and non-CAD files, full history revisions. You can map maturity, whether the data should go to in work or release states, variable mappings, bookmark mappings, etc. So let's just look at a quick video of this. For those of you who are not familiar with it. So we're going to quickly show data in SolidWorks PDM. And then we can run the transition assistant. There's a whole, wizard to go through, but we can pick what folders we want to load and what collab space they get loaded to. We can also map those folders to different bookmarks within the system. We then, we can also do data mappings, but we'll analyze the data to get loaded, make sure there's no major issues before we load the data. And then basically we load the data based on jobs. So we create a job to load the data. We can see the status of that job loading data. And then once it finishes, we see all our data loaded to 3DEXPERIENCE. That went a little fast, but we see the data loaded into 3DEXPERIENCE, into the bookmark we picked, and the collab space we picked. So that's a very quick overview of how the transition assistant works. Again, for more details, please reach out to me after this presentation. So let's say you don't have SolidWorks PDM. You're in another system like Team Center, but you want to load data to 3DEXPERIENCE, and you want to load your SolidWorks data to 3DEXPERIENCE. If you're on premise, we can make use of the XPDM technology, which again, it really is a type of XML format to load the data. So we can extract the data from Team Center or any other system into that XML format that supports physical products, 3D shapes, documents, links, and then have a way to automatically read the 3D XML files and load them into the platform. Again, this is not out of the box. There would need to be work and development or configuration to do it, but it's all doable. We would make use of the EXH and maybe the MUX licenses within 3DEXPERIENCE, stands for Exchange. part of the tools we'll use to import the data is called this batch importer tool. It's part of the native CATIA apps, so we need to install the native apps to get to it. So that might be a little bit different for SOLIDWORKS users, but very straightforward. This is really the only supported migration process by DS to load CAD data into the platform is, for on-premise to use the XPDM technology. We can also make use of what's called cat rule files to do data transformation. I talk about data transformation on the way out. We can do data transformation on the way in. For example, if the user is Marc in Smart Team, we could change the owner to Ilan in 3DEXPERIENCE. And you have the ability, obviously, to map metadata properties as well. You do that through this PDM custom config file. Though again, it's sensitive to bad data, missing references, spaces at the end of file names, etc. May cause data to fail. And then obviously it can support logging. Point being of the slide is if you have data in another system that's non-DSO, we can get that data into 3DEXPERIENCE. If you want to get data into 3DEXPERIENCE from another system, but you're on cloud 3DEXPERIENCE, there's also technologies to do that as well. In that case, we make use of the EIF technology, Enterprise Integration Framework. And really, that whole transition assistant is built on top of this technology here. So the EIF really comprises of these roles: an integration architect, an exchange manager, and then you have exchange tokens to load the data. But again, if you wanted to get the data from a external system, I'll use Windchill in this example, into 3DEXPERIENCE on cloud, we can build the StepX files, which again is a different type of XML file, to extract the data into. And then we would basically, this is a little bit technical, call various web services in 3DEXPERIENCE to upload those step files, upload the data to be loaded, and then call the Exchange IP APIs to import those data packages. And we can do all sorts of things such as, create the import, submit the import, retry the import, modify it, etc., based on, how well, monitor it, etc., based on, that data import package. So point being, again, you have SOLIDWORKS data you want to get into 3DEXPERIENCE coming from another system. There's technology out there to do it. Migration considerations, obviously, you need to handle different data models between the legacy system and 3DEXPERIENCE. There's that full mapping exercise that needs to be done. Any type of data being migrated really needs to be migrated like it was created, through the out-of-the-box tools in 3DEXPERIENCE, through that, the SOLIDWORKS connector. You never want to migrate data and then have users say, we can't use it because it was migrated the wrong way in. So we need to make sure that the data is migrated in a supported way. And then dealing with large migrations. So, the goal is to do any migration in a reasonable time frame, i.e. a weekend, be able to shut down the system on, Friday night, and then have everyone up and running Monday morning with the new system and the new data. So doing this, what we call a big bang or a single migration, is, the best way to go. But there's cases where there's so much data, we can't do it over a weekend. And therefore, a delta migration, comes into play. Both EDAT and XTA supports delta migrations. And sometimes you need to go that way, though. If you do, it does take more time, because not only do you need to test the migration, but you need to test the delta aspects of the migration as well. And then sometimes improving speed is simply improving hardware, making sure you're on SSD drives, increasing memory, having different input and output drives for data access, etc. So testing the migration. This is, probably the most important slide out of all the slides. It's extremely important to test your migrated data. No data will be migrated successfully the first time, and there probably will be issues with migrated data that won't be found until they're tested and mitigated. So with any good testing, it's key to have a good test plan. Don't just tell users, go test the data and give me your feedback. Build a test plan for users to test against and make sure they are testing against it. So have different scenarios in your test plan. Can they, work with large assemblies? Can they work with assemblies that have standard parts in them? Put that data, through a change. Does it properly go through a change, and can you change that data? What happens if you combine migrate data with new data? Does everything work and behave as expected? And run through actual scenarios, day in the life of an engineer to make sure everything works as expected. Like I said, you will find issues, and it may be with the legacy data. You need to do more data cleanup. Maybe it's with your migration code or the migration tools. There's bugs in them, or you're extracting the data in the wrong way, or you have a mapping that's not correct. So you'll find issues that need to be fixed. And then you could have procedural issues. If you're assigning all the data to different owners in the system, make sure those users exist in the system before you assign that owner attribute. Document the migration procedures. When you do this for live, you want a checkbox of these are the steps I need to do. These are the estimated times each step will take, and follow that documented procedure. You should go through this enough times so you have it pretty well done and know what to expect for that production migration. And any changes you make, whether it's a configuration of the system, a change to your data set, a change to your migration tools, test again. Don't just say, oh, it's a minimal change, it won't have an effect. Even sometimes the smallest changes can affect migrations. So this should be an iterative process, probably 2 to 4 times before you get all the kinks out. Sometimes you might have to do it 5, 6, 7 times. But it's no fun having a system that users can't use because the data is not usable. So testing is key. Pre-data loading planning, before you do the final migration, obviously you want to work with the stakeholders, to have a good understanding when the legacy system will be turned off. You should have a good understanding of how long it'll take to load the data into the system. And make that decision. Can it be done during business or non-business hours? Hopefully you will have documented that data loading process and have everything, identified any pre-data loading activities, post-data loading activities, key stakeholders contact list, etc. Follow your documented data loading sequence, and obviously have the key people identified for various parts of the data migration, whether that's IT, engineers to validate the data, etc. So final data load, I'd always say with the proper planning and testing, the final data load should go smoothly. Follow your documented procedures, though there's always Murphy's Law. Make sure you have some buffer time for unexpected issues, and then be prepared to support the users in the new system. There will be a learning curve, but having the right training and support in place will get them fastly up to speed and being more efficient in 3DEXPERIENCE. So hopefully that would be as easy as the easy go button. But with that, let me open it up to questions. So if you do have any questions, please put them in to chat and I'll be happy to answer them. So one question is, how long, should a data migration project take? And that's always, very dependent on, the source system and your migration rules. But a, SOLIDWORKS PDM to 3DEXPERIENCE migration, probably is a, 2 to 3 month long project, not necessarily 2 to 3 full-time billing days. It would be a lot less, but from start to configuring everything, running multiple tests, and that final Production migration, I would say between 2 to 2 to 4 months. Next question, can you create step files for the SOLIDWORKS data to be migrated? So yes, that's very doable. You know, I would probably do that maybe as a post-processing operation, so I get all that SOLIDWORKS data into the system in the first place, and then we can add the step files after the fact. You want to keep them in 3DEXPERIENCE or somewhere else. So there's details to go into it, but the simple answer is yes, it can be done. So the question is, what happens post go live if you import with missing references? Will the assemblies blow up on first opening? So if you load data with missing references, they'll go into the system, you'll open the data, and the assembly will complain about the missing reference. So either you can delete the reference, fix the reference, I guess leave the bad reference there. It may not let you save it again if the bad reference. So after the fact, you will need to clean up the bad reference, but it should be able to go into the system, so at least it's there to be fixed the next time the user goes to modify it. So some of the tech, I talked about XPDM. This question is about what technologies can you use to load data. I think it's more geared to like languages or computer programming. Both the EIF or that StepX file and XPDM, you can use various languages to create it, and then to load it, you want some type of orchestration to load it. I mentioned ActiveMQ. It's a open source type of tool that is a type of job queue. So there you can control with it, what data has been loaded, what data needs to be loaded, what data failed. When the EDAT and the transition assistant tools do this for you automatically, but if you're doing your own migration, not only you need to control data getting loaded, but there's a loading order. So I alluded to parts should be loaded before assemblies. Dependencies need to be loaded first. The dependent file needs to be loaded before the file that's depending on it. So you need to orchestrate how that data gets loaded, and you need to use a technology, and there's many different ones out there to orchestrate that order, and then process the data properly, and control successes, failures, retries, etc. Looks like the last question here, it says, will this presentation be available? So the video, everyone should get a link to the video. If you want the presentation itself, please reach out to me per the contact on the screen, and I'll be happy to send you a version of the presentation. Likewise, if you have any additional questions or follow-ups on the topics covered, or anything else related to 3DEXPERIENCE or PLM or SOLIDWORKS in general, please reach out to me per the contact information on the screen. It looks like those are all the questions for now. I'm gonna stay on for another minute and then end the presentation, but if you do have any more questions, please type them in, or again, as mentioned, reach out to me. Once again, thank you very much for attending this presentation, and I look forward to additional topics. If you have any additional topics, please again, send them my way. I'm always interested in what people want to learn on, so I'd be happy to hear any other topics you'd be interested in us presenting on at XLM Solutions. But once again, thank you very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.